Sigrun had killed 11 men before her 20th winter, and none of it had prepared her for the one she pulled out of the Skarheim River with her own bare hands. 3 ribs cracked, his skin steaming where the ice touched him, as if something underneath him was burning even as the current tried to drown it out. Comment where you're watching from, if you've ever saved the one person who could destroy your entire life without even knowing your name. Like and subscribe if you believe the debts of blood always find their way home. The river that split the eastern half of Skarheim territory ran black in the last hour before dawn, black and fast and full of splinters from the bridge that had collapsed 2 nights before, under weight no ordinary man should have been able to put on it. Sigrun had been sent to check the wreckage because Mother Yrsa trusted no one else to walk the ice without falling through it, and because the 22 soldiers assigned to the border patrol had come back saying there was nothing in the water but debris. Sigrun did not believe in nothing. She had spent 19 years learning that nothing was the lie people told when they hadn't looked closely enough, and so she had gone out alone, in the dark, with a hunting knife strapped to her thigh and a coil of oiled rope over her shoulder, because that was what she had been raised to do since she was 7 years old, and Steward Ulrich Drogmar's household had first discovered that the bastard daughter of a dead kitchen woman could move without sound. She found him 40 feet downstream from the broken bridge, half submerged, his left arm bent at an angle that told her the bone had gone before the cold could finish him off. His skin was too pale even for a corpse, gray-blue in the moonlight, and when she rolled him onto his back to check for breath, she saw the fur. Not fur across his whole body. That would have made sense, would have told her plainly what she was dealing with, but patches of it, black and silver, spreading up one forearm and along his jaw, in a pattern that looked like frost eating through wood. His pupils, when she pried one eye open, were gold slitted through with black, an animal's eyes set into a human face that kept trying and failing to decide which shape it wanted to hold. He was seizing, his spine arching, and beneath his ribs she could feel something moving that had no business moving, a second heartbeat layered under the first, out of time with it by exactly half a second, as if 2 different creatures were fighting over the same chest. She had seen curses before. Mother Yrsa kept a locked chest of texts on the subject, most of them useless, written by clerics who had never once touched a cursed man and were simply guessing. But Sigrun had spent 4 years apprenticed to Yrsa in secret, in the hours between her real duties, learning to read blood the way other girls learn to read letters, and she recognized this one from a passage she'd copied out longhand at 14. Iron-bound transformation, forced and interrupted, the kind that happened when a shift was triggered by poison rather than by will. Someone had done this to him on purpose. Someone had wanted him caught exactly between shapes, neither wolf nor man, weak in both. She pressed 2 fingers to the pulse at his throat and counted. 41 beats in 15 seconds, then a stutter, then 38, the rhythm sawing up and down like a blade sharpened against a whetstone that kept slipping. His breath came out in a plume that froze halfway to nothing, and beneath the plume she caught a bitterness that had no business existing in blood that bled clean, a chemical sourness she'd smelled only once before, on the breath of a poisoned hound the kennel master had ordered put down rather than treated. Whoever had done this had not wanted a quick death. They had wanted a slow one that could be blamed on the river, on the cold, on anything but a blade or a bottle. She dragged him to the frozen bank on a makeshift sled of broken planking, wrapped his forearm in strips torn from her own tunic, and set his shoulder back into its socket with a crack that made him howl in a voice that was not quite human and not quite wolf, some third register in between that raised the hair on her arms. She did not know his name. She did not know, in that hour, that the wet black hair plastered to his skull belonged to Halvard Ashclaw, wolf sovereign of Skarheim, ruler of the 11 packs of the northern range, thought by every soul in the capital to be safely asleep in his own fortified bedchamber 4 miles inland. She only knew that his fever was climbing past what a body should survive, that his second heartbeat was slowing while his first one raced, and that if she left him there, he would be dead before the sun cleared the tree line. So she carried him. 19 years old, 5'4" in her boots, carrying a man who outweighed her by nearly 90 pounds across 3 miles of frozen ground, because she refused, on some old, stubborn, unexamined principle, to let something finish dying in front of her that she had already decided to save. That was the first open loop, though she did not think of it in those terms. Whatever curse had been laid on him was still working, silent and patient, somewhere under his skin. And it would not stop, simply because she had gotten him out of the water. She brought him to the old woodcutter's cabin 1/2 mile from Yrsa's hut, the one nobody used anymore because the roof leaked, and she built a fire hot enough to steam the ice out of both their clothes, and she sat with a knife across her knees and watched him for 6 hours, while his body fought whatever poison had been dropped into it. Twice his hand became a hand, fingers stretching, claws retracting, and twice it curled back into something with black claws and a wolf's proportion, the transformation stuttering like a candle flame in wind. When dawn came through the cracked shutters, he opened his eyes, human this time, gray-gold, exhausted, and the first words Halvard Ashclaw ever said to Sigrun were, "You should have let the river have me." She told him, flatly, that the river hadn't asked her permission, and he laughed, a short, broken sound that turned into a cough, and that was the moment, though neither of them named it yet, that something between them locked into place like a key finding the one groove it fit. He did not tell her who he was. Not that morning, not for 6 more days, during which she kept him hidden in the cabin against every instinct that told her to report a stranger found half-transformed and clearly hunted, because something in his eyes when he looked at the northern ridge, toward the capital, toward Skarheim's black stone keep, told her that whoever had poisoned him lived inside those walls, close enough to reach him again if word got out that he'd survived. He called himself Hal. He said he was a border scout, which was almost true in the way that lies from careful men usually are. He asked her name, and she gave him only Sig, because a bastard raised as a knife in a great house learns early that a full name is a leash someone else can hold. The cabin itself was barely fit for the task. Its roof had 3 gaps wide enough to drop a fist through, and Sigrun spent the second day stuffing them with moss and pine pitch, while Hal slept in fever fits on the room's single cot, his hands twitching between fingers and claws even in unconsciousness. She rationed the dried venison she'd brought for her own patrol into portions thin enough to last 9 days instead of 3, ate half of what she needed, and told herself the hunger was a small thing, the kind of small thing she'd been managing her whole life. On the 3rd night, he woke lucid enough to notice the rationing, watched her chew a strip of venison so tough it took 40 separate bites, and said, "Horse, you're starving so I can eat." She told him plainly that a man who couldn't hold his own shape needed the meat more than a woman who could still walk a straight line, and he laughed, weakly, and said that was the first time in 11 years anyone had argued with him about anything without first apologizing for the argument. That was Loop B, though it would not surface fully until the fire had burned low on the 4th night, the contempt loop, the one built out of what she was and what the world above her believed that meant. Because on the 4th night, Lady Freydis Hallamir rode past the tree line with 6 huntsmen searching for signs of the missing sovereign, and Sigrun, hidden in the underbrush with Hal's arms slung over her shoulder as she half carried him deeper into cover, heard Freydis's voice ring out clear across the frost. "If the wolf sovereign is found dead in a ditch, at least let it be said he wasn't found in the arms of some kitchen-born stray." Freydis did not know Sigrun was there, crouched 20 feet off in shadow, with Halvard's full weight braced against her shoulder, both of them still as the frost-heavy pines around them. Freydis's huntsmen laughed at the line, low and obliging, the way men laugh when their livelihoods depend on finding a noblewoman's cruelty entertaining, and one of them added something about how the river ought to have finished the job properly if it was going to start it at all. Sigrun said nothing. She simply filed the sentence away the way she filed every blade she meant to use later, tucked behind her ribs, next to 11 other insults collected over 19 years of being spoken about, as though she couldn't hear, each one waiting, patient, for the day there would finally be a room large enough and public enough to hand every single one of them back. Loop C planted itself on the 5th night, when Hal, fevered again and half delirious, gripped Sigrun's wrist hard enough to bruise and said, "The dagger, under the 3rd floorboard, the one with the crack. If I don't wake up, take it to Mother Yrsa, not the steward. Yrsa, tell her the wolf rune matches the one on the Var seal." Sigrun did not know what the Var seal was. She would learn 3 days later, when she finally pried up that floorboard herself and found an iron dagger wrapped in oilcloth, its hilt stamped with a running wolf circled by a rune she had seen exactly once before in her life, burned faintly into the underside of her dead mother's only surviving necklace, a piece of jewelry Sigrun had kept hidden in a seam of her boot since she was 7 years old and had never once understood. If you have ever found out that the thing you were told made you worthless was, all along, the one thing that made you dangerous to the people who lied to you, you already know where this is going. Comment the moment you realized your own blood was the weapon they'd been afraid of the whole time. For 6 days, Sigrun nursed Hal Ashclaw back from the edge of a death that had been arranged for him with precision. She learned piece by piece from the things his fever loosened in him that he was not a border scout at all, that his rank sat far above what a girl born in a scullery was meant to speak to directly, let alone touch, let alone hold against her chest, through a night when his transformation nearly tore him apart on the cabin floor. She learned it fully on the 7th morning, when his fever broke and his eyes cleared, and he sat up steady for the first time and said, quietly, watching her face, for the exact moment the words would land, "My name isn't Hal, it's Halvard. I am the Wolf Sovereign of Skarheim, and someone inside my own household tried to have me killed disguised as an accident, and you are the only person in 11 packs worth of territory who doesn't yet know enough about me to have a reason to finish the job." She did not flinch, and that, more than the 6 days of care already given, was what undid something in him. Every noblewoman who had ever been paraded in front of him flinched at his titles, leaned into them, reorganized her whole spine around the weight of what he was. Sigrun only asked, "Who wants you dead?" in the same flat voice she'd have used to ask about the weather, and something in Halvard's chest, the human half of it, not the wolf's, recognized, for the first time in years, a person who wanted nothing from his crown. He healed enough to travel in 9 days, though the curse had not lifted, it had only quieted, banked like coals under ash, flaring at the edges of his control whenever his temper rose or his fear did. He told her the physicians in the capital had called it exhaustion when the first symptoms appeared 3 weeks earlier, the same week his steward, Ulrich Drogmar, had begun quietly circulating the idea that the sovereign's judgment could no longer be trusted, that a regency council might be needed for the good of the Pax. Halvard had not believed Ulrich capable of poison until the night he'd woken on a hunting trip with his own guard captain, Ketil Stonebrook, standing over him with a blade already drawn, hesitating just long enough for Halvard, half-shifted and desperate, to throw himself off the bridge into the Black River, rather than die on dry land where the fall could be called an accident cleanly. Ketil's hesitation was the first crack in the conspiracy, though none of them knew it yet. A coward's mercy, offered too late to matter and too real to fully hide. Halvard returned to the capital in secret, through the servants' gate, with Sigrun at his side because he refused, flatly, in a tone that brooked no argument from a man used to being obeyed, to walk back into that keep, without the one person who had already proven she could be trusted with his exact, exposed, half-transformed self. The gate itself was guarded by a boy no older than 15, who nearly raised the alarm at the sight of the sovereign returning half-dressed in borrowed furs. And it was Sigrun who silenced him with 2 words and a coin, a small transaction of the kind she had performed 100 times in her years running Drogmar's errands, and never once thought to question until now, when she realized how easily a lifetime of small invisible competencies had prepared her for exactly this night. Mother Yrsa was awake despite the hour, bent over a table of drying herbs by a single candle, and she did not startle when the door opened on a sovereign presumed dead, and the girl she had trained in secret for 4 years. She only set down her mortar, wiped her hands on her apron, and asked to see the wound first, and the story after, a healer's instinct so old it had outlasted every other loyalty in her. She examined Halvard's forearm, his jaw, the faint frost pattern still ghosting under his skin, and pronounced the curse banked but not broken, the kind that would flare again under enough pressure, unless its root cause, whoever had brewed it, was found and stopped. Only then did she turn to the dagger Sigrun carried, took one look at the hilt, and turned it over twice in trembling hands, before speaking the words that broke the last loop wide open. "Var, your mother was a Var." The exiled clan line, the one the old king scattered 40 years ago for refusing to swear the blood oath to Drogmar's grandfather. Girl, you are not kitchen-born. You are the last living heir of a clan that once stood equal to the throne, hidden as a servant because it was safer than being hunted. 30% of the way into everything Sigrun had lived through that winter, that single sentence rearranged the entire shape of her life, and it is exactly here, hearing it, that you should stop and ask yourself the same question she asked herself in the silence after Yrsa spoke. How much of what we're told about our own worth was only ever someone else's convenience dressed up as fact? If that question has ever cracked something open in you, stay through to the end, because Sigrun was about to make the people who lied to her answer for it, in front of everyone who'd ever watched her be diminished. Ulrich Draugmar, informed within the week that the sovereign had survived and returned, did not panic the way a lesser conspirator would have. He was too controlled for that, too many years practiced at bending truth into something load-bearing. He proposed, instead, a ritual duel, an old Skarheim law almost never invoked, allowing any noble to challenge the sovereign's fitness to rule if credible doubt existed about his judgment or health, the challenge to be settled publicly, in the stone arena beneath the keep, before the assembled packs. He framed it as concern. He framed it, publicly, as loyalty. Better the packs see with their own eyes that their sovereign was whole, he said, than let rumors of a cursed, half-transformed ruler fester in the dark. Privately, he was gambling that Halvard's control over his own shift, still unstable from 6 days of curse fever, would fracture under the pressure of combat in front of witnesses, and that whatever happened next could be called, cleanly, an accident. Lady Freydis volunteered, sweetly, publicly, to stand as Halvard's second in the duel, a gesture that looked like devotion and was, underneath, an attempt to be close enough to the outcome to steer it. She had never stopped believing that her bloodline entitled her to the mate seat beside the throne, and she had never stopped despising the girl she'd once called a kitchen-born stray, without knowing that girl was standing 4 feet away in the dark, memorizing every syllable. At 70% of the way through what became the longest 6 weeks of Sigrun's life, the second loop closed with a precision that felt, to her, less like triumph and more like a debt finally settled. Halvard, informed of Ulrich's true role by Kettle Stonebrook himself, the guard captain arriving at the keep at midnight, unarmed, shaking, confessing everything in exchange for nothing but the chance to undo what he'd nearly done, chose not to expose the steward quietly. Kettle had knelt on the stone floor of the private chamber, his voice cracking through an account of exactly how the poison had been mixed into the sovereign's evening wine 3 weeks running, how the bridge had been weakened deliberately, with a saw hidden under a cloak, how Ulrich had promised him a captaincy over all 11 Pax garrisons if he finished what the bridge and the poison together had failed to do. Kettle had raised his blade that night on the hunting trip, fully intending to use it, he admitted, and had lowered it only because Halvard's eyes, half-wolf and terrified, had looked in that instant exactly like Kettle's own younger brother's eyes had looked the night a border skirmish took him, a resemblance sharp enough to stop a coward's hand where months of planning had not. He chose, instead, to let the ritual duel proceed exactly as Ulrich had designed it, because a public stage cuts both ways, and Halvard intended to use it. The morning of the duel came in hard and clear, the kind of cold that turned every breath in the arena into its own small ghost. Frost rimed the stone benches in a fine white lattice that the first 1,000 arrivals had already melted through with their bodies by the time Sigrun took her place at the edge of the ring in a borrowed guard's cloak. The Var dagger, at her hip for the first time in her life, worn openly rather than hidden in a boot seam. She counted the tiers as they filled. 11 bands of stone for 11 packs, each marked by a different banner snapping stiff in the wind, and watched 4,000 faces turn, one by one, toward the sealed gate where their sovereign would enter to prove whether he could still hold his shape under pressure. Ulrich stood in the front row, wearing the calm expression of a man who has already counted his winnings. Freydis stood beside him in furs the color of old blood, smiling the smile of someone who believes the story is already written. Halvard entered the ring without armor, which the crowd read as arrogance, and Sigrun read correctly as strategy. He wanted nothing between his skin and what was coming. Ulrich had arranged for the challenge to be met not by himself, coward that he was, but by a champion, a hired duelist named Skarde, 7 feet of augmented muscle and old grudge, chosen specifically because his presence in the ring would force Halvard to shift fully or die, and a forced shift, so soon after curse fever, was exactly the fracture point Ulrich was counting on. The first exchange lasted 6 seconds and drew blood from Halvard's forearm, a shallow line that steamed faintly in the cold morning air. The second exchange lasted 11, Skarde's blade catching the light in a wide arc that Halvard rolled beneath, coming up with dust and old snow clinging to his bare shoulders. The crowd's noise rose and fell in waves timed to every near miss, 4,000 voices breathing in unison like a single animal, and Sigrun, forbidden from the ring floor by every rule she knew, felt her own pulse climbing to match the rhythm of his. It came, in the third exchange, exactly as planned, Halvard's control slipping, his spine arching, the 2 heartbeats stutter from that first night on the riverbank returning in front of 4,000 witnesses, his shape caught agonizingly between man and wolf, while Skarde raised a blade, meant to end things while he was weakest. And it was Sigrun, not authorized, not summoned, breaking every rule of the ritual's neutrality, who crossed the ring floor in under 2 seconds and put herself between that blade and her sovereign, the Var dagger raised, the wolf rune on its hilt catching the noon light so every person in that arena saw it at once. The duel's own ancient law saved her before anyone could object. Any bearer of a recognized clan seal had the right to stand as second in defense of a sovereign under threat of unlawful interference, and unlawful interference was exactly what a hired duelist meeting a fractured, curse-weakened ruler constituted. Mother Yrsa, seated in the council box specifically to be ready for this moment, stood and declared the seal's authenticity before Ulrich could gather breath to dispute it. 4,000 people watched a girl they'd been told to see as nothing hold a blade steady between their ruler and a paid killer, and they watched the crest on that blade name her as the last living Var. Halvard's shift stabilized the instant the immediate threat lifted, not because the curse was cured, but because, Yrsa would explain later, curses of that kind fed on isolation and failed the moment the person carrying them stopped believing they had to survive alone. He rose, human again, and looked at Sigrun standing over him with a stolen blade and a stolen name finally returned to her, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say that the whole arena hadn't already understood. Ulrich Draugmar's collapse took less time than his conspiracy had taken to build. Ketil's confession, already recorded before the council, was read aloud within the hour, naming the poison, the bridge sabotage, the false diagnosis paid for from Ulrich's own coffers. Freydis, seeing which way the wind had turned, tried to distance herself with the same practiced grace she'd used to insult a servant she assumed could never rise, and it was Sigrun, not Halvard, not the council, who repeated Freydis's own words back to her, in front of the same crowd that had heard them the first time only by accident. If the wolf sovereign is found dead, at least let it not be in the arms of a kitchen-born stray. Freydis had no answer for hearing her own cruelty handed back to her with interest, in front of everyone whose opinion she had built her whole life around. At 95% of everything that had happened since a girl pulled a dying stranger out of a frozen river, Ulrich Draugmar was stripped of his office and sentenced to exile beyond the eastern range, forbidden ever to cross back into Skarheim territory on pain of death, a mercy only because Halvard, even furious, refused to become the kind of sovereign who ruled by blood alone. Skarda the duelist, having been paid to kill rather than to judge, was banished from the fighting circuits of all 11 packs, his name struck from every roll that had once respected it. Ketil Stonebrook, whose hesitation on that bridge had been the first true crack in the whole conspiracy, was stripped of his captaincy, but spared exile, sentenced instead to a decade's service, guarding the border he had once nearly failed to protect. A chance, Halvard said, to become the man his one moment of mercy had proven he still might be. Freydis Hallamir was quietly removed from the council's list of eligible mate candidates, her family's standing reduced by a formal, public censure that would follow her name for the rest of her life. She left the capital within the month and was not spoken of again. Mother Yrsa was granted, for her decades of quiet service, and her willingness to stand and speak the truth before a council that could have destroyed her for it. A permanent seat on Skarheim's ruling body. The first healer in the kingdom's recorded history to hold such a place. A seat she accepted only after making Halvard promise, in front of witnesses, that no future sovereign would ever again be permitted to hide an illness from his own physicians, the way Halvard's pride had nearly let him hide his. Sigrun was named, before the same crowd that had once been ready to watch her die in that arena, as an unauthorized nobody, the restored heir of Clan Var. Her lands and titles returned in full, her mother's exile formally and publicly reversed, as an injustice of the old king's making. Halvard Ashclaw, Wolf Sovereign of Skarheim, stood before 11 packs and declared, with no crown between them and no title left for anyone to hide behind, that the woman who had carried him 3 miles across frozen ground without knowing his name would carry the mate seal beside his throne for as long as either of them drew breath, not because law demanded it, but because 6 days in a leaking cabin had taught him the only kind of loyalty worth building a kingdom on. She did not answer him with a speech. She only reached up and set her mother's rune-marked necklace, the one she'd hidden in her boot for 12 years, plainly around her own throat where every person watching could see it, and asked, quietly, whether he intended to keep bleeding on her floors, now that he was sovereign again, or whether he planned to finally let someone else hold the knife for a change. The crowd's laughter cracked the tension of the whole ritual wide open, rolling up through the 11-tiered banners until even the guards at the sealed gate were grinning, and somewhere in the noise of it, Mother Yrsa was already murmuring to no one in particular that curses fed on isolation and died the moment 2 people refused to carry anything alone again. Halvard reached for Sigrun's hand in front of 4,000 witnesses who had, 6 weeks earlier, known her only as a name attached to a scullery, and he did not let go of it through the entire long walk back out of the arena, past Freydis's empty seat, past the space where Ulrich's chains would be fitted within the hour, out into the cold, clean light of a kingdom that finally knew both their names correctly. And if you have ever wondered whether the thing that saves you might be the same thing everyone once told you made you worthless, you already understand exactly what Sigrun understood in that arena. But 3 miles east, past the tree line, past the frozen bridge where all of this had started, something was still moving through the water that no one in Skarheim had yet thought to ask about. And next time, we find out exactly what Ulrich Draugmar buried in that riverbed before he ever laid a hand on his own sovereign.